Fantastic job, and I appreciate that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. A former law enforcement officer, Mr. D'Esposito, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. And this is rare, but I have to disagree with my colleagues when they say that this isn't partisan. This is actually, in fact, partisan, because Democrats and their legislation has created this issue, whether it's here in Washington, D.C., in our nation's capital, or if it's home in New York. They have passed and promoted pro-criminal, anti-law enforcement legislation that has led us to this situation. Law enforcement officers actually wear handcuffs on their gun belts to use them against criminals. But Democrats in places like New York and Washington, D.C., have allowed those handcuffs to be put on us to not do our jobs. And I know that in the beginning of the hearing, we heard that the beginning of this year, it seems that crime is down in Washington, D.C., and Chief Manger, Mr. Pemberton, you guys have been in law enforcement for how many years?
45.
45?
19.
19, that's 64. We'll add mine in, let's say, almost 80 years. All right, 80 years on the job. What season do we usually see the least amount of crime committed, especially those on the street? Probably be the winter, right? When the weather gets nicer, crime tends to spike. Okay. So now, I know that we also talked about guns. One of the issues that we're facing with guns throughout this country is that people are getting arrested with illegal firearms, and they're not getting prosecuted. We see guns being taken off the streets, but very often the criminals who tote those firearms are able to walk the streets freely again before the cops are actually done with their paperwork. Now, Mr. Pemberton, I know that you were in the violent crime unit, similar to the work that I did. If you had to take a guess, an estimation, how many firearms, how many guns gun arrests have you been a part of in your career?
I would have to say over 1,000.
Okay. My number's probably a little less. You have some more time on the job. My next question is this. Out of the over 1,000 gun arrests that you were part of, how many of those individuals, when you went to arrest them, presented you with a license to carry that gun?
0.
So gun licensing really would have nothing to do with the carrying of firearms, because those who are breaking the law really don't care about what gun laws are, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, in all of the guns that you have recovered, I guess we should focus more recently here in Washington, D.C., because it seems like the other side of the aisle wants to talk about assault weapons. They want to talk about high capacity firearms, when in fact, much of the time, the people who speak the most, and I'm not talking about Mr. Morelli at all, I have great respect for him, but there are people who love to speak about high capacity weapons. They love to talk about guns that are in mass shootings. But in fact, they really don't know much about firearms, and they don't even know about the guns that they're speaking of. So in the arrests that have been made by the MPD, how many of the guns over the last year would have been handguns? You could give an estimate. I'm sure you don't have the number off the top of your head.
Yeah, I don't. I know that last year we recovered like 3,200 firearms. I don't know how many were handguns, but I would venture a guess that it was at least 90%.
So 90% of the guns recovered last year in Washington, D.C., you said 3,200 were recovered, so 90% of them were handguns, illegal firearms, and not one of those people probably presented a license to carry it.
I think that's fair, yes.
Okay. And a lot of those individuals were repeat offenders, right? They've been arrested, they've been part of the criminal justice system. Why? Because over the last few years, legislation implemented by Democrats throughout this country has made this country less safe. It's a fact. And Mr. Manguel, I know that you mentioned in your opening statement about the dwindling number of police officers. Why do you think we have a dwindling number of police officers?
I think a lot of it has to do with the rhetoric and the environment that's been created by policy, and I have some personal experience with this.
Exactly right. It's the rhetoric and it's the policy that's been created. It's the rhetoric that is being spewed by Democrats here on Capitol Hill, by anti-cop people throughout this country, and it's the policies, not only policy, because now we're talking about laws, actually things that are on the books. People took pens, put them to paper, and passed legislation to make this country less safe, to make the jobs of law enforcement harder, and to give criminals free rein to do whatever it is they want without any repercussions. It's why, right here on Capitol Hill, you can't go to CVS and get batteries because they're locked up. Why? Because people go into stores, take whatever they want, and walk right out. That is the country. That is the city that Democrats have created. And I blame it, and I say it's partisan, because they're the ones who have carried this banner. They're the ones who have passed this legislation, and they're the ones who have doubled down and said, we're going to continue to do this. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.